Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon, Episode 41, General Lafayette, Hero of Two Worlds. Before we get to our episode, I'd like to remind our listeners that we have a new YouTube page up for Generals and Napoleon where you can hear all of these episodes. So please check us out on YouTube when you get a minute. And now, on to the show. We have a very special guest for this episode. We have a fellow podcaster, Emmanuel Dubois, from the podcast Lafayette. We are here. Say hello, Emmanuel.
Hello, John.
Bonjour.
Bonjour, exactly.
Yeah. So I thought for this particular episode, we'd focus on one of the most famous generals, both in America and France, Lafayette. And I was hoping my good friend Emmanuel will tell us all about this interesting man. But before we get to that, can you tell us a bit about your podcast, Lafayette? We are here. What is it? What is that about?
Yes, so my podcast is the French history podcast for the American public by a Frenchman, me. So I really bring a French perspective on France's history because I found that in America, especially, there is a lot of interest for French history.
Yep.
But it often comes from the British point of view because we speak the same language, so it makes a lot of sense.
Right.
But that means that you're often lacking the actual French point of view because it doesn't get translated, or people will not look for those sources. And me, I was raised, I was born in France, even though I've been in Canada for most of my life. But I have a French upbringing and culture, and I studied French history. So that's why I'm trying to bring. And the figure of Lafayette was chosen because he is, as we will discuss, that link between France and America. And it's a very rare and almost unique link between two nations, as we will come to discuss.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out that France is our oldest ally in the United States. So
Yes.
yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think Lafayette's a very fascinating character, especially for the American Revolution and in the times of Napoleon. And we'll kind of dive into him here. He was born in September 1757 in a South Central France province called, and I'll let you pronounce it.
Yes, Auvergne.
Thank you. And his father was a colonel in a grenadier regiment. Was he born into an aristocratic family?
Yes. So it's a very old aristocratic family, dating back from the 13th century, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I read like some of his ancestors were even in the Crusades.
Yeah, and one of them was a Maréchal de France, a marshal.
Yep.
There is also a very famous writer, Madame de Lafayette, who wrote novels and plays, I believe, a few decades or maybe a century before he was born. And so it's a very old, well-established French noble family and very well respected within the French kingdom.
Okay. However, 2 years after his birth, his father is killed in a battle fighting the British in a battle in Westphalia. This seems to tear his family apart, doesn't it? Because his family, or excuse me, his mother leaves for Paris kind of right after that. What kind of happens in his early years?
Yeah, he had not a troubled childhood because it was, in comfort and everything. And just before we go on, I just want to say his actual full name because it's actually
Sure, please.
funny.
Yeah.
It's Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert Dumotier, Marquis de Lafayette. Marquis de Lafayette is his title. He's going to become the Marquis in French, of
Right.
Lafayette when his father dies. And the rest is actually his name. But he would not say all of this. Of course, each time, these noble people love to give you 5, 6 first names. He would go by Gilbert Dumotier. That is what he would say, and he would present himself as the Marquis de Lafayette. So he's brought up as your average French nobleman in the 1760s and 70s. That means he's going to be either a soldier or a clergyman. That's pretty much the two avenues that you could have as a young man in France if you were a nobleman.
Right.
And he chose the path of the soldier, just like his father before. And as you mentioned, his father died in Westphalia at the Battle of Minden. And that's a kind of leave a mark on the young Lafayette, because of course he's only two, but he will never know his father. But he knows that he died during a war against Britain. And that's going to have repercussions later in his life.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. After he moves to Paris in 1768, his mother dies 2 years later.
Hmm.
He basically inherits the family estates at a very young age, 12 or 13. And what
Yes.
I think is interesting is, you know, he, as a 13-year-old, that's great. You inherit all this wealth. He could have just lived a life of luxury, but he chose not to. He chose to do something with his life.
Yeah, he could have. And that's when you very early on, you can to see his very unique character. He will do everything you would not expect of somebody in his position. As you mentioned, he inherits a huge fortune. He's actually one of the richest men in the country,
Hmm.
because when his mother dies, his grandfather takes care of him, and then he dies.
Yeah.
And at that time, when you're a teenager, if you're not a complete idiot, when you have money, you consider, more or less autonomous. They're gonna,
Right.
and
Right.
he's everything but an idiot. He's also, he starts training as a musketeer,
Hmm.
mousquetaire, like we say in French.
Hmm.
So he's really, he's getting good education, trained as an officer, a soldier. He also marries very young, at
Yeah.
16 or 17, which,
Yeah.
it's very common at the time,
Sure.
with Marie de Noailles. And her family is also very rich, very distinguished, and very close to the French throne, actually, closer than
Mm-hmm.
his. His family is more from what we call in France the province, which means
Hmm.
outside of Paris.
Hmm.
Auvergne is quite far away from Paris.
Hmm.
She's closer to the capital, and to the Versailles court. And during his upbringing and his teenage years, they will try to make him a man of the court, a courtesan, but that's not him. He's
Hmm.
not one to dress up and go dancing in balls and go before dukes and counts and go, Your Majesty. That's just not him.
Indeed, and it seems like he had a happy marriage, from what I can read.
He did, even though it was an arranged marriage. And to be honest, during his life, he won't be always a faithful husband. But
Hmm.
as I said, that also is not uncommon at the time.
Hmm.
They will still be together for a very long time until her death, actually, and she will die way before him. And they had a good relationship,
Yeah.
especially for in those nobles families, it was not always the case. I recall you talked about the marshals of France and of Napoleon
Oh
and their
yeah.
wives. It was not always
Yeah. The happiest. Yeah.
steady.
Yeah.
He will do better. Um, but I do think that even as a very young man, Lafayette was looking for a cause worth fighting for,
Yeah.
maybe even dying for. Part of that, I think, is inheritance from his family. In the moral sense, yeah, like his father died fighting for France, and I think he's looking at an opportunity to do this. And that's when you guys,
You guys.
Americans,
Yeah.
gave him that opportunity.
Yeah. I think this is interesting. Now we're still talking his teenage years, and he
Mhm.
learns about a growing revolt in America, and he decides, you know what, I want to go over there. I want to be part of this revolution. What do you think the appeal was, other than the opportunity to fight the British,
Yeah.
of the
So
American Revolution?
so that's a good point. If you want to get any Frenchman to do anything, ask him is gonna be against the British. That's a unifying factor right there.
Right. Right.
you know,
Right.
but it sounds stupid, but it's actually a good point. The way he learns about America is that because in 1775 he is invited to a diner in Metz. Metz is called it's written METZ. We say Metz.
Yeah.
Is in Lorraine, France, so northeastern France, next to the German border.
Hmm.
He's invited by a guy named the Comte de Breuil, and it's a diner in honor of the Duke of Gloucester. That man is the brother of King George III.
Okay.
They have those fancy diners, and because of his family and his wife's family, he's invited to that diner. And he's only 17 years old.
Right.
And the Duke keeps talking about those damn American insurgents, as he called them, because in 1775, it's you don't have the Declaration of Independence yet, but trouble is starting to stir quite firmly.
Correct.
And hearing about this from that very petulant man, he's like, "I'm gonna join this guy."
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'm exaggerating a bit, but it triggers something in him. I think he thought your cause was good,
Yeah.
and he recognized that the Americans had a point.
Yeah.
If we want to be independent, let us.
Yeah.
We're on country now,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and it's funny because the Americans fought the French just 20 years before as part of the British Empire.
Yeah. But there's a lot of new ideals out about democracy.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, in the sense, he's very influenced by the Lumière, the French Enlightenment.
Yeah.
That's obvious. Rousseau and other French thinkers who believed in, self-determination, in liberty, individual freedom. He's very influenced by that. But the thing is, he's one of those few people who's gonna put his money where his mouth is.
Hmm.
He's gonna fight for it. He's gonna risk his life. He's gonna get wounded. He's gonna get imprisoned. He's gonna really put his life on the line for these ideals more than most philosophers or noblemen or soldiers. He's gonna be true to that his whole life, to the very end. And that starts when he's 17 years old. So he will and and he has a very adventurous temper. He doesn't fear risk, and
Yeah.
as you said, he's independent financially, so he can do
Yeah.
whatever the heck he wants.
Yeah, and I'd like to point out too that he's not the only Frenchman thinking this. The French government hopes that by supplying the Americans with guns, equipment, and troops, they might restore French influence and territory lost in the French and Indian War.
Yeah,
And
because
so
that
young,
was a major blow.
yeah, indeed, that was a huge loss for France. And so young Lafayette insists upon being part of the French expedition. He becomes a major general despite his age, which is incredible. And I think the other part is, like you were saying before, he's able to finance himself. He learns that the U.S. government can't finance his voyage, so he buys his own ship and arrives in South Carolina in 1777. This is a 20-year-old man. It's almost impossible.
Yeah, and he didn't even speak English. He
Yeah,
learned it on the boat,
yeah,
and then he perfected it when he comes to America.
yeah.
And what I like also is that but the funny thing, even though the French government is all too happy to help, uh, um, Viennoisans to the British,
Right,
they're still not at war with England at that point.
right.
So technically, what Lafayette is doing is illegal. He's not supposed to go to America at that point.
Hmm.
We're not supposed to send actual soldiers in the French army yet
Right.
in America.
And I read
So,
that the king
so
didn't approve this.
the
Yeah,
king did not, and is actually, there is he should be arrested.
right.
And actually, when he will come back to France, he will be arrested. But as we'll see, it's going to be more for form than anything else.
Hmm.
Um, and so he could be arrested by the French or the English, and he still manages to go all the way to America. And
So,
he arrives, as you mentioned, in 1777, close to Georgetown, um, and he will be quite quickly presented or introduced to George Washington.
yeah, does he bond well with Commander in Chief George Washington?
I would say more than well. They become friends pretty quickly, and they're going to be very close friends for the remaining years of George Washington's life. I think there's kind of a father-son relationship there. There are
Yeah.
20 years difference. The fact that Lafayette never really had a father, and Washington is very impressed by him. He's made, as you mentioned, he's made a major general, and
Hmm.
he sees that young man is brilliant, he's competent, he's a
Hmm.
good soldier. He sees that he can bring, I mean, he's a good soldier, and the French soldiers, they had a good training,
Yeah.
and they're trained to fight against whom exactly?
The
The
British.
British. So it's a good
Yeah.
addition to the Continental Army.
You make a
uh,
good point there because he knows British tactics because he's been trained to fight against that.
Yeah, and the French knew that a war was coming with Britain. At that point, it's not if, it's when. And
Right.
during the 17th, 18th centuries, they were just fighting each other all the time.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, this young lad is put in charge of American troops. He fights. His first battle is at Brandywine at the
Yep.
end of 77. He's
Yep.
wounded, a
Yep.
bullet to the leg, not nothing.
Nothing
Uh,
serious though. Yeah.
yeah, but still takes him a few weeks to recover. And
Hmm.
again, fights in Monmouth. He proves a very able commander. Congress congratulates him. So from the get go, he has quite a reputation and a good career as part of the Continental Army.
Yeah. And he after the Battle of Gloucester, he beats a Hessian force in the pay of the British at
Hmm.
Gloucester. And he said something interesting, which I thought was very, I've never heard a general say. And he tells Washington, I'm here to learn, not to teach. Yeah, that was a quote. And I think I'm trying to figure out what he meant by that. Is he, even though he's a young man, he still wants to learn. He's not trying to be General Washington and be all important. Like, I think he's trying to learn as he's a general, which I think is interesting.
Yeah, I think he always knew his place.
Mm-hmm.
He always know, and he never drove for power. That's something we're gonna see during the French Revolution a lot. At some point, he could have been head of government.
Right.
He never tried to be. With the prestige that he will have, everything he could have been easily, and he will never even try. That's just not the person he is.
He,
He wants to do what's good in his eyes, and that's not him becoming the big boss, if you will.
yeah, he had no political aspirations. Yeah.
No, and I
Yeah.
think that's part of the reason why Washington loved him so much, because he recognized that in that man, he was not, a potential competitor.
Mhm.
He was gonna serve the cause more than
Mhm.
anything else. And
Yeah.
quick note: do you know the name of Lafayette's son?
Is it George?
Is George Washington. Actually, he gave him both names. George Washington in honor of his friend.
I did. I think I did read that. Yeah.
Mm,
That's quite an honor to name your son after, um,
yeah.
basically your mentor there. That's very
Yeah,
interesting.
pretty much. I think he learned a lot with George Washington. They were often, when they were not together, they were exchanging letters all the time.
Yeah.
So they have a very good working relationship. But as I said, they did become true friends.
He performs well in the battles of 1778, but he returns to France in 1779. Is that because he was worn out, or was he trying to bring more French troops and influence to America? Why do you think he returned to France at that time?
It's more because he wants to persuade the French government of direct intervention in America. He Because he wants to help the cause, right? So in his view, the best way to do that is to bring the French army and navy into the combat.
Right.
So when he arrives, it's a funny thing because when he gets back to France, he's greeted as a hero, but
Hmm.
since he disobeyed the king 2 years before, he is condemned to 10 days of house arrest. you
Mm.
know, Basically,
Slap
R&R
on the
period.
wrist.
you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
so get some rest and we'll start over. Okay, fine. And he will contribute to making France, to involving France in the war.
Yeah.
And at that point, France as a country has recovered from the 7 Years' War militarily. They actually rebuilt the fleet
Yeah.
completely, so they have a very modern fleet
Hmm.
and one that can actually compete with the Royal Navy. And he will also convince the French government, I mean the king and his foreign ministry, to send more men than they initially thought they should send.
Hmm.
So when he comes back to France, to the US, it's with 6,000 troops, which is
Yeah.
quite a lot.
Yeah.
6,000 professional soldiers.
Yeah.
Uh,
And I read in 1780 he gets back to Boston and he's greeted with a lot of enthusiasm. It almost seems like he's a celebrity at this point.
he starts to become one.
Yeah.
I would say he's not. I mean, he's very well known, but his legend is growing. And he manages to be the bridge between the two countries, along with people like Benjamin Franklin. You have to realize that at the time, France and Great Britain are the two superpowers. No other nation state is even close to them. So
Correct.
when France gets involved in the conflict, it's a big deal. It's a
Mhm.
very big deal. Um, and like the 7 Years' War before that was almost a world war. I mean, you had
Yeah, it was.
you had combats in Europe, in America, in
Yeah.
Asia, on the
All this.
oceans. It's huge.
Yeah, it is. And
Um,
I don't want to knock out the other French contributors. Rochambeau and
mhm,
many. Marshal Berthier. He served in America, so
yes,
there was a lot of French involvement in America at the time. In 1781, though, Lafayette assisted Washington in the Yorktown campaign,
Mhm.
leading to the eventual British capitulation. What do you think his contributions overall were to the American war effort?
Well, I think as a leading officer, he was one of the officers that Washington knew he could count on all the time. He was one of those men you could send in pretty much any situation, and you know that he will take the right decisions.
Mm-hmm.
He was a good man leader, and he knew how to analyze tactical situation. So,
Mm-hmm.
as purely military man, he was very important. You wanted him in your army.
Right.
Um, and also, he still was that link between the two countries, even though you have, as you said, Rochambeau, Berthier, or you have the Admiral d'Estaing,
Yep.
who is leading the French fleet.
Yep.
All They all play a role, but Lafayette is the unifying figure, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
between those two. And Lafayette is the other men involved in this are there because their king told them to go.
Right.
Lafayette is there because he wants America to win this. He wants America to be independent. He wants to make his point, and he wants your republic to establish itself
Mm-hmm.
because the American Republic was established with ideals he believed in. And at the time it had never been done. And the American Republic is a social experiment, really, with all these ideas of equality, the American, Declaration of Independence, and then your Constitution. All those ideas are very close to the French Enlightenment,
Mm-hmm.
but have never been put into practice yet.
Yeah.
And he sees that as an opportunity to do that. And then you will have, a bit later, the French Revolution was going to be strike two of that
Yeah. Yeah.
agenda.
Yeah. And I was going to bring that up. A few years later, after America wins its independence, Lafayette finds himself in the middle of another revolution, this time in his home country. What was his role during this chaotic time with, King Louis XVI is deposed and beheaded? What, how is Lafayette navigating this time? Because, I mean, it was a dangerous time to be an aristocrat and rich in France.
Yeah, very dangerous actually. What Lafayette, even before the revolution actually starts, he's trying to help solve the situation because he knows it's coming. I mean, maybe not in the form that it took, but he knows that the country is in a bad shape.
Mm-hmm.
The French helped the American during the war, but that cost them pretty much all the money they had.
Right, right.
It was a very expensive war in a country that was actually with big financial difficulties. So it's kind of the last straw financially. And then you have all the French societal structure, which is about to collapse anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And Lafayette wants to modernize people, I mean, the French society. So, for example, in 1787, there is a nobleman assembly in France to try to bring some ideas to solve some issues.
Mm-hmm.
And he's advancing ideas of freedom, equality, and to hereditary privileges, even though he got his position because of them, but he wants to get rid of those. And his ideas are completely ignored. Uh, when you have the Estates General, which is basically the French king is summoning the French nobles, clergymen, and the commoners
Yep.
in May 1789, he is an elected representative
Mm-hmm.
and is putting forward the same ideas. So when the revolution erupts in July 1789, Lafayette embraces it. He doesn't want to kill the king.
Right.
That will take more time, and he will never be for that. But he wants change. He wants France to become a more egalitarian society.
Right.
So, because of his prestige and military experience, right from the get-go, he's named commander of the newly formed French National Guard.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing he does is to destroy the Bastille fortress, the famous prison,
Yep.
which had been taken by the revolutionaries on July 14th.
Yep.
And he destroys it because he understands that it's a symbol of
Mm-hmm.
monarchy, of monarchic oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he also creates the tricolor cockade for his troops, and those colors are blue, white, and red.
Right.
Blue and red being the colors of the city of Paris, and white being the color of the monarchy. And you
Mm-hmm.
have these together, and that makes the current French flag. So Lafayette created the French flag.
Right.
Um, and he also very quickly has a hand in the writing of the Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which is a pillar document in French and you could say even world history,
Correct.
to declare rights for everybody. He is one of the writers, but it won't last very long though, because the French Revolution very quickly turns into a very violent affair, and
Yeah.
more of a power struggle than really freedom, fighting against tyranny. You have political factions that show up, and Lafayette is not a politician, so he very quickly loses political power. Is pushed aside by more extremist revolutionaries, and the last blow comes in June 1781 when the French King Louis XVI flees during the night along with his family. And even though he's caught and arrested in a city called Varennes, that's why we called it the flight to Varennes.
Yep.
Even though he was not going to Varennes, he was just passing through, but that's where they caught him. The problem is that Lafayette was in charge of the king's security. So, it looked bad on him. Some people even accused him of having helped the king, but he never did that. But, it just looked bad.
Right.
And I think they just wanted to get rid of him because he was not an extremist. He wanted a constitutional monarchy. He didn't want a republic, not at the beginning anyway. He basically wanted a country with good law and order and laws made to represent the people, in a modern way, just like the Americans had done. It didn't have to be a republic. It had to be a good equalitarian society.
Right.
So he resigns in 1791. He retreats to his land in Auvergne. But he's very soon called back because the next year, basically the whole of Europe declares war on France, especially when we remove the king from power, establish the republic, and that triggers pretty much everybody declares war on France because they want to restore the old power. They're fearing what is happening in France.
Right.
And so he joins the army to defend the country against pretty much everybody else. But he still don't want the king to be, killed, even though it's not done yet.
Right.
And you have a lot of Frenchmen turning against each other at that point. It's before what we call the Terror, but it's getting close to there. And he decides that he should leave France.
Yeah.
And
it's a sad moment. He has to flee his home country.
Yeah, completely. He's that's the funny thing. He's labeled a traitor by the French revolutionaries, but he's labeled a revolutionary by everybody else.
Right.
So when he crosses the border, he's arrested by Austrian troops, and that's when he's sent to prison for 5 years
for quote fomenting rebellions, end quote.
Yeah, exactly.
And it sounds a bit extreme. 5 years. I mean, that seems like a long time.
It is. Basically, it was condemned for lifetime. And that's not until a certain Corsican general comes around that he will be freed.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So, obviously the reign of terror kind of flames out. The Directory government comes in, and Napoleon is a general for the Directory government. He's not running the government just yet. But then in 1800, he's made his coup. He's first consul. And Napoleon helped secure his freedom.
Yeah, it's actually when they did the Treaty of Campo Formio in October 1797, after the campaign of Italy.
That's right.
One of the demands of Napoleon and France are that Lafayette should be freed. And it's granted, at that point, the Austrian, it's not like they have much to say. So he's freed by Napoleon, or should say by the treaty that he signs. And I do think that Napoleon at this point, Napoleon is younger than him, and he's still, just as you said, just a general, even though he's signing treaties without approval of the government. He doesn't know Lafayette really personally. That I think maybe he met him once, but they all know each other. And he might have liked to have that man with him,
right?
But it won't happen because 2 years after that, Napoleon takes power, as you said, during the 18 Brumaire coup.
Yep.
And Lafayette denounces that, and then he refuses the post of ambassador to the United States, and he will again retire on his lands in Auvergne. He just won't serve Napoleon because he considers him a despot. He considers that he's destroying the revolution, and that he's not much better than the kings
Right.
before him. But
But you
Nap-
think he'd be a little appreciative because Napoleon got him out of prison, you know?
that's true, yeah.
Yeah, I don't I get it. Like he has Republican principles, and Napoleon was an autocrat and a dictator. But you think he'd be all right? Well, you know, Napoleon's better than the Reign of Terror or the Directory.
Mm.
Maybe I should just go along with it. But you're right. That's just not his way.
That's just not his way. He just won't serve a regime he doesn't believe in. That's not him. He just won't do that. And we'll see that even after Napoleon was gone. Lafayette will hold true to these ideals. So he doesn't care who Napoleon is and what he's accomplishing. I mean, I'm sure he respected the man and the military genius that he was, because as a military man himself, he could recognize that, and appreciate it. But he won't serve somebody that he doesn't like, basically. And that's what happened. So basically, during the whole empire period, I mean, during the consulate and the empire, Lafayette doesn't do much.
But his wife passes in
Yes.
1807, and I think that really hurts him, and he kind of withdraws from public life.
Yeah, for some time he does, and actually he retries until 1815. So because when Napoleon comes back during the 100 Days, for that for a small amount of time, Lafayette actually supports him.
Hmm.
There are a few reasons, and it's not always clear why, but my analysis is that I think he believes Napoleon when he says that he wants to reform France to make
Hmm.
it more democratic. And I think Lafayette is like, okay, maybe there is a chance here.
Hmm.
And or actually wants to help that happen. And he becomes actually a representative in the assembly, even as the deputy of Seine-et-Marne, and
Hmm.
he's even chosen as vice president of that assembly. So he's playing a role.
Hmm.
But after Waterloo, he basically ditches Napoleon. He's like, okay, we're done with that man. I
Yeah.
think, like many people, he just wanted France to have peace. At that point, the country has been at war for over 20 years.
Right.
It's
And,
just not sustainable.
yeah, and he probably lost a lot of military friends in the wars, and just France in general, like you said, was in shambles. So he just
Mm,
probably wanted to have stability at that point.
yeah.
Yep.
And the funny thing, though, is that the Bourbon monarchy is restored with King Louis the 18th, who is
Hmm.
Louis the 16th's brother, because his son died
Hmm.
in 1795. And Lafayette is very wary of that new king.
Hmm.
He thinks he won't respect the French Constitution, just like he did in 1814. I mean, Louis XVIII is really not a great king.
Hmm.
Um, he thinks that he will try to retake some of the old days' power, and indeed, Louis XVIII tries to. And he does find Lafayette on his way, though.
Right.
Lafayette is elected in Sarthe as a representative in 1818, and he keeps fighting the same fight for individual liberties. He opposes all power, abuse of power by the king. He's defeated in an election in 1824, and that's when he goes back to the States
Right.
for a year or so. And he's granted a hero's welcome. The Americans just can't get enough of him. They
Oh, yeah, they
love
love.
him.
Yep.
I think he did a whole circuit there that you can still make.
Yeah.
There's like the Lafayette Trail, I think
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
it.
Like a tour you can do. Yeah. Yeah. That's
So he
right.
can go where he wants.
Yep.
And they're just very happy to have him again. Almost 30 years after, over 30 years after the war.
Yeah.
Um, and he returns to France and is elected again in 1827.
Hmm.
And the thing is that in France is about to have other trouble. Louis XVIII died in 1824, and Charles X becomes king.
Right.
And Charles X is an even worse king. He removes lots of civil liberties,
Right.
abolishes the liberty of the press, and it just goes on and on and on.
Hmm.
And you have this in the other factors in Europe that causes the 1830 revolution.
Right.
It's not as big as the 1789 one, but it's big enough that it's gonna out the king. you know.
Right. Right.
And Lafayette plays a role in this during what we call the Trois Glorieuses, which means the 3 glorious days,
Yep.
insurrection of 1830. That's what you actually see in Les Misérables of Victor Hugo.
Yeah.
That's that revolution, not the one before. Everybody, I mean, I know a lot of people in America that think it's the first French Revolution. Nope, Les Misérables is during 1830.
That's right. That's right. And
uh,
Marmont cannot put down the revolution, and the king has to flee the country.
Yeah, he has to flee. So he's named Lafayette is again named commander of the National Guard again, and he leads the Duke of Orléans to the City Hall of Paris, and that man is going to be the next king, Louis Philippe.
Yep.
So yeah, as you mentioned, Charles X is overthrown, has to flee, and that new French government is nicknamed the July Monarchy because it all happened in
In
July
July.
1830.
Yep.
Um, and the funny thing is, some insurrectionists they want to reestablish a republic. They don't want another king. And guess who they chose as president?
Mm.
They wanted Lafayette to be president.
Of course.
Uh, and Lafayette at that time is 72.
Right.
And 72 in 1830 is like, I don't know, 96 today. It's especially for a man like him that's been fighting and in
Right.
prison. I can't imagine. I mean, the guy was strong. Um, but Lafayette, as we said, that's just not his way. He doesn't. His drive is not power; it's
Yeah.
justice more than anything else.
Yeah.
So he wants a constitutional monarchy, and also maybe he was a bit tired too. I mean, as I said, he's 72 for God's sake, and he is elected in the new government,
Right.
and he keeps fighting the same fights.
Yeah.
Each time he sees an abuse of power, he opposes it. In France and even outside of France, I think he supported some causes in Poland and Spain. He was very present all over Europe,
Yeah.
and he will eventually die of pneumonia in 1834, age 76.
Right.
And when he dies, he's granted the same funeral honors by American Congress as they did George Washington.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. What do you think his legacy is, both in America and France, and I guess overall?
I think first, for the two countries, France and America, they have an history together that is hard to find another example of. Let me go back to an example. Um, on July 4th, 1917, U.S. Army Colonel Charles Stanton made a speech at the Picpus Cemetery in France, where the Marquis de Lafayette is buried.
Mm-hmm.
America just had joined the Allied cause in World War One
Right.
alongside France and Great Britain. And Stanton's speech, who was approved by General Pershing, was concluded by this little paragraph. He said, quote, America has joined forces with the Allied powers, and what we have of blood and treasure are yours. Therefore, it is with loving pride that we drape the colors in tribute of respect to the citizen of your great republic. And here and now, in the shadow of the illustrious dead, we pledge our heart and our honor in carrying this war to a successful issue. Lafayette, we are here. So
Mm.
that colonel was honoring Lafayette almost, 150 years after he went to America.
Yeah,
Um,
and thus the name of your podcast.
there you go. That's where I took it from. The sentence was pronounced by that man
That's amazing.
because he established that link between the two countries. There's that very strong symbol of friendship born through hard times, and that common values are more important than nationalities. And Lafayette held true to these values his whole life. And it's not that common, especially with someone involved in politics. You could call him stubborn, even. He just
But
held true to that his whole life.
did he
And
learn how to be a politician? Because it seems like he never learned how to compromise his values. Like, and I know that's the goal of being a diplomat and a politician. Sometimes you have to compromise. It
that's
seems like
true.
he never really. Maybe he learned how to do it, but he never wanted to do it.
Yeah, he never wanted to do it, and he's never a true politician in that sense because, as you said, he doesn't compromise. Like Napoleon will compromise during his life, especially at the beginning, like in the consulate.
Yep.
He won't. That's just not the man he is, and that's maybe why he never rose that high in terms of political life. Never really above a representative. That's just not the man he was. And I think in America, you see him as that war hero, the man that helped you become independent. In France, we know about this, and it's very important in his legacy. The role that for a long time, the role that he played in the French Revolution was, how can I put it, a gray area. because the French Revolution is so complex.
Yeah, there's a lot of
And
parts and a lot of gray area, like you said. Yeah.
yeah, and it was so violent, and still today, in France you have people who claim to be claim to have inherited the French Revolution ideals like completely.
Hmm.
Almost Jacobin people, power to
Right.
the people to the max, almost no government and what have you, or very, very, you would say left wing maybe. And then you have French people that are very traditionalist, almost monarchists. You have even monarchist people in France
Right.
to this day. And like, for example, the power that we have now in France is a compromise between the two because it is a republic, it's a
Yeah.
democracy, but the French president is very powerful. Is more powerful than most head of states in
Right.
the world. So it is that balance between France wanting to be a strong country with a strong government, and yet having the people have their say.
That's very interesting. I learned so much in our chat right there about Lafayette that I didn't know, both his influence on America and France and the world in general. I really appreciate that. Before we go, Emmanuel, I do want to talk about your podcast one more time, Lafayette. We are here. And you also have a Twitter page, right?
Yeah. So you can find the podcast on whatever platform you listen podcast on,
Mm-hmm.
or on LafayettePodcast.com. As for the Twitter page, it's at Lafayette Pod. You have also all the links on the web page, including if you prefer to follow me on Reddit or Instagram, what have you. But my main social media is Twitter, and I do one episode a month, and I do on any subject. Like I did a couple episodes on our friend Napoleon.
Yep.
I did one on the French Revolution. My last one is on the French defeat of 1940, the fall of France against
Yeah,
the.
World War II. I just listened to that. It was really good.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you very much again, John. I really appreciate the opportunity, and we'll talk soon.
All right, Emmanuel. Thanks for your time.